This is What I Did Next from A&T Media. I'm Malak Fuad, your host. You're listening to the Season 2 wrap-up episode. I want to start off by saying thank you to our guests who've joined us over the last few months, and to you, our listeners. To wrap up our second season today, I'm joined by my co-producer, Chirag Desai, to talk about the highlights from the last 8 episodes and to look ahead to Season 3.
So hello Malak, how are you?
I'm good, Chirag. How are you? How's Dubai treating you?
Well, the weather is getting better, so I'm very happy about that. This is what we look forward to.
Yeah.
This is what we withstand the summer for, I think.
Absolutely.
But it's been busy, right? We've had the expo launch in October, so it's been really busy since then. Yeah.
I'm dying to come and see that. Actually, it's supposed to be amazing.
How about you guys?
Yeah, Cairo's good, busy as well. Lots going on, and it's good to chat with you today and have a wrap up of the season.
So actually, before we get into sort of talking about the wrap up and kind of reminiscing a little bit about season 2, I should say congratulations, because What I Did Next actually made it to Apple Podcasts Best Shows of 2021, which is an annual list they put out every year about podcasts.
Yeah, I'm amazed. When you called me to tell me that, I couldn't believe it. It's a real honor. It's a big honor for us, for you and me and the show, and it's a huge validation. We're on the right track, I think, Chirag. It's kind of cementing a little bit, the direction of the show. It's showing us that, we have a great audience, we have a great listenership. And it's just a great, way to end the year. It's a podcast, as you know, Chirag, that, a year ago was just an idea. You and I were discussing it in very broad terms. And after 2 seasons, to get this recognition is very special, and I'm extremely happy about it.
And also a big thank you to the Apple Podcast team as well, because I know that they go through all the shows that are out and they look and see what they believe are, the big pivotal shows of the year. I mean, and they mentioned as well when they announced the list that it was about the fact that they looked at shows that provided a sense of comfort and a sense of like a good experience in challenging times, which the year was. So I think it just makes that a little bit of a lovely recognition. And so, congratulations to you as well. Yeah.
Thank you. And congratulations to you, Chirag. This is impossible to have done without you. So it's a great team effort.
What I want to kick off with is just kind of, we want to talk a little bit about kind of the season, right? How we felt about it. So I want to get your initial thoughts in first.
So as you know, I consciously wanted season 2 to be different to season 1. And as you know, season 1 was very Egypt-centric. And that was obviously a natural place to start with the launch of the podcast for me. But as you know, the series and all the podcasts that are going to be coming out of A&T Media are all geared to the Middle East as a region. So I consciously wanted to find people who could represent different parts of the region. And I think you'll agree that we were able to do that with some people from Lebanon, from Saudi, from Iraq, and of course from Egypt as well. And I just think it adds a lot of interest. It shows people's differences, but it also shows so much how we're all really the same. And I think you can even extrapolate that further. And people's life journeys tend to the essence of them is often very similar. The nitty gritty or the details of them are obviously different, but it was interesting to see the parallels. So that was something I was very conscious of trying to do. And then I was also really conscious that I wanted there to be a balance of men and women. I didn't want to be just women or just men. And of course, a balance of industries and careers and sectors. So that was a really important thing for me. And I actually went out and crafted it that way. To have a little bit of for everyone.
So I'm looking at it almost from a producer lens, right? And I look at so we've done 2 seasons now, and I'm looking at the evolution of what happened between season 1 and season 2. So one of the things that I think came out or stood out to me, especially in season 2, was how impactful childhood can be, or the early stages of your life can be, right? And this is something I think it almost showed up in every episode, if you really think about it, although I think maybe for a couple it was a little bit maybe mid-age, let's say. But if you look at, for example, Fatima and Amina, who were the season openers, right? So watching their mother be a single mom, launch a company, had such a gravitational pull for them that they both today run major aspects of that business today, right? You look at someone like Hassan Damlouji, who, so he was completely disconnected from his Iraqi roots.
You know, my dad said to us, we're British now. You're British. It's better for you to be British. You know, just forget the Middle East.
That acted as such a counterpole that the only thing he wanted to do was to find a way to come back to and then contribute to the Middle East, which he ended up doing at an early age, of course. And then, of course, you look at someone like Kim Ghattas, for example, right? She grew up in Lebanon amidst war, and that became, I want to tell the stories of this region, and basically shaped her entire journey and continues to shape it today. Dr. Lama Suleiman, right? She was forced to stay back, even though her sisters went away to educate, and she wanted to rebel against that, and all of that shaped where she went, and continues to again today. So I think that's so interesting.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, but I think there's actually within that context, you can even divide it up further. So you have how influential the family is on the individual, but you also have how influential the environment is. So of course, in Kim Ghattas's situation, she has both because she's half Dutch, half Lebanese, and that plays a big role in her ability, I think, to look at things with a sort of a detached ability, and that obviously helps in journalism. But obviously, as well, the war that she lived through informs everything that she does as well. So that's an interesting sort of, duality there. I also think that it's very interesting that we heard from people who had positive things to say about the influence of family. We didn't hear anyone talk about negative things, which is obviously quite natural. People don't want to dwell on the negative, and if people had a negative experience, they're unlikely to talk about it in a public space like this. I think the one who came closest to it probably was Bobby, who, acknowledged that his parents sort of moved him around a lot and it wasn't something he necessarily liked. But then he talks about how his grandparents provided that stability and security for him.
My grandparents raised me, a couple parts of my life, which were the grounding thing. I always told my grandmother, like, Mom, Mommy, if it wasn't for you, I would have chosen a life of crime. I would have been gangster,
I think it's also a sign of evolution or a sign of dealing with it, right? So when you say that they reflected on it positively today, I'm sure those experiences were and could have been very negative, right? I mean, to live through war, to feel so disconnected from roots, for example, can actually have negative impacts, right? We see that happen.
Absolutely.
I'm sure we all know people who are struggling through that even in adult life.
Of course.
And so I think if we have people who are turning around and saying, well, ultimately it shaped me and look at positive. I mean, Dr. Lama Suleiman comes to mind right away, right? Because she felt so rebellious against the fact that she was not given the opportunity she wanted, which is she wanted to leave. And she was forced to stay back almost. But today she reflects on it very positively to say ultimately, there was good in it for me.
It shaped her, for sure.
Yeah.
No, and I think she was always very cognizant of why she was asked to stay behind, and she talks very positively about her family, and you don't feel that there was any kind of resentment there. But I think the interesting one as well to bring up here is Prince Abbas Helmi, because he had a very he was wrenched out of his life at the age of 16 and made to go into exile, and that's a very sort of potentially traumatic situation for a 16-year-old. Already teenage boys are, not the most comfortable in their skin. It could have had quite detrimental effects on him, but he's come out of it in a very sort of almost peaceful way out of that. And it's I think that's a sign of a very stable family life, actually, to be in that situation and get through it and come out of it quite, intact and still attached to your family, and seeing the positive sides of that, I think is quite interesting.
when you look at the focus of the show, and the reason we focus on these pivot points is because we think it makes them, right? It makes the people ultimately.
Absolutely.
I keep reading this because it keeps showing up as a quote. It's like adversity is not so much about the fact that you will face difficulties, but how you rise up from it, right? And I think Prince Abbas mentioned as well. He was like, I was never interested in politics, so it's not my thing. Which is also partially a reaction to be like, because he had seen maybe the worst of it.
One thing I found really interesting from the interviews from this season was how some people knew their calling, if you like, from a very young age, and how others really struggled to find themselves. A very clear example is Amina Ghali in our first interview, who says that from a very, very young age, she knew exactly what she wanted to do, in the sense that she knew she wanted a creative life. She knew that she, that in a way it's so liberating to be so sure of yourself at such a young age, because, you just pursue that and that's it. Whereas someone like Bobby, who tried 1,000,001 things until he found what suited him, a very different life journey. Then you have someone also like Kim Ghattas, who from a very young age knew that she wanted to explain the situation they were living in, and knew that the best way for her to do that was through a career in journalism.
I felt that I wanted the world to better understand what was going on in my country. And I thought that if they did, then, they might help put an end to it. And that's why I also decided to become a journalist, because I thought, okay, this is my role. I have to explain what is really going on so that perhaps world leaders can bring this to an end. Of course, the war ended when I was 13 years old, but I was still on my mission to become a journalist, and I pursued that.
And then, of course, Max's story, which is fabulous, where he's standing in Brooklyn looking at the docks, the shipping docks, and sees a ship going to Egypt, and you couldn't write it as a script. It's fabulous.
It's almost serendipity, right? Like you don't know what you're thinking of doing, and suddenly you're just like,
and
well, I only have a ticket to
it.
Egypt. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. And you can visualize it as he's saying it, and it's almost like a scene in one of the Tintin books that he likes, where he just has to get back to Egypt, and that's where he goes back, and that's where his real life begins. And these are the stories that they're just so charming, aren't they? They endear the people to you, and they make you want to hear more about their life.
Yeah, and it becomes relatable, right? I think we all go through those kind of moments where we continue to reimagine and wonder if we took the path, what would have happened? If we didn't take the path, what would have happened? And I think it's also contrast is always something that's very interesting to me, right? So when you look at, for example, someone like an Amina and a Hassan against each other, both knew what they wanted to do at a very early age. One pursued it, got there, is already there. And then you have someone like a Hassan who, despite knowing that, had to retreat at some point and say, actually, I think this is the way to go.
Yeah.
And then similarly, if you look at contrast, even between the sisters, right? So they grew up in the exact same environment. Amina knew exactly what she wanted to do, and Fatima had no idea and was trying.
Well, I think she kind of knew
like
that
indirectly.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
Indirectly, exactly. Yeah, so it was a very interesting journey of discovery into these people's lives, because there were a few of them that I knew from before or had read about them. For example, in the case of Kim, but hearing their stories directly from them, and the parts of their story that they chose to highlight as well, I think is quite interesting. Neda Dibs, of course, from a family of merchants and textile, a very sort of typical Levantian family of textile merchants, although growing up in Japan is a very unusual twist in her story. Mm-hmm. But her family insisted that she follow a business path in order to follow them in the business. And so she did it because it was what was asked of her. But she did it knowing that that's not what she wanted to do. And then eventually she got her way and stood her ground and went off and did her thing. And that's really interesting as well to me, because, the very typical of the Middle East, where you, as a child in a family or a young adult, you feel almost obligated to follow what you're being told to do. In a lot of cultures, and I think, in Asia, there's a lot of that as well.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So a lot of these people went and did what they were required to do, but eventually found the guts and the courage to go off and do what they wanted to do. And I think in most cases, family comes around. They see that it's the right thing for you, it's the right path, and they accept it, and they see you're happy. So it's interesting.
It's almost the theme of this season is family, I think, like how it kind of all boils down.
Yeah,
to
there's
that
a lot
almost,
of that. You're right.
Yeah. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about today in terms of looking at that is a very specific word actually that came up on the show. And the first time I heard it, I just thought it was an interesting usage. I don't think a lot of people use the word, and the word is chameleon. And it first came up during Bobby Jin's episode, and his context was slightly different, right? So he actually mentioned it the first time when he was talking about his comedy.
Improvisational comedy is not about being funny. It's about the character. So, like, for example, my life is filled with these characters. So I can go, it was not you, Kenny, crazy, Bobby, right? So Nigerian, Arab, English.
Yeah.
I do all that.
Yeah,
I just imitate. I'm a chameleon.
Yeah,
I'm just going in.
But then he mentioned it a second time on the episode later when he was talking about kind of all the different roles he was doing and how he can fit himself into multiple things. And that has a lot to do with his childhood because he did so many different things that he turned around and said, well, I'm a chameleon. I can do anything. It's fine. Like, I'll go, if this doesn't work out, I'll go, I'll go be a head waiter, or I can do that, and I can do this, and I can go back to comedy and all of that. Which in and of itself, like I said, as the usage was interesting until we came to the last episode of the season, and then Prince Abbas goes,
I'm a chameleon.
You're a chameleon, depending on where you are.
In France, I'm French, and I'm blessed with the fact that I have this gift. I can feel completely at home almost anywhere, I think.
And I just that word just stood out for me as something that, again, not common usage, but slightly different context, but ultimately saying the same thing. It became about the flexibility, the adaptability, and I think that's actually consistent across almost everybody we've interviewed this season.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, Chirag, and I think it's a really interesting observation. And as you said, they all have it, and I think it's a product of being of more than one culture, and I don't mean it in the sense of necessarily being half this or half that, but I think a lot of the people we interviewed either lived outside the Middle East or have connections outside the Middle East, in which case they've had to almost put on a persona to be someone else somewhere else. And if you remember, Nada Dibbs grew up in Japan, and how a lot of the time, when she was there, she felt like an outsider. But now, her Japanese aesthetic, firstly, it infuses everything she does in her work, but it also, has a big role to play in her own makeup, in her attitudes and the way she thinks. And I think that allows you to almost put a coat on when you need to and then take it off when you don't need it, depending on the circumstances. I think the flip side, for example, Amina and Fatma grew up in Egypt their entire life, and they don't have that. So they're very much of Egypt. They are very much, they wear the badge, they wear the cloak of Egypt, and rightly so and proudly so. But they're not chameleons. So they, if they're in the UK or in Dubai or in the US, promoting their business, they're very much Egyptian women running an Egyptian brand, and that's interesting. That they are, there's a difference there.
Correct. So funnily, Nada Dibbs was my other extreme example, right? And the reason I say that is because what we defined just now is a concept of what is popularly called the third culture kid syndrome, right? Of being of multiple cultures rather than not necessarily, like you said, half this or half that. Nada is such a mixture, right? So she's Lebanese roots. She grew up. She has a Japanese childhood, and then the US, then the UK. She lived some time in Lebanon as well, and now is back in Lebanon. And I think it presents such an interesting thing because at least in her story, you see the whole range of the contrasts that happen because of it. So as you mentioned, she feels like an outsider, but then she finds a way to meld. And then when she was in the US, she was like, I was living in the countryside and I was American, right? And I wanted to stay there and I wanted to be part of it. And then when she went to the UK, it was again a mixture where when she started designing, she started approaching actually and like looked for the Arab community there to try and reach out, because that's where she felt she would see the synergy in terms of what eventually, of course, her designs have worldwide appeal today. But so it's so interesting how not only can you adapt, but then how do you kind of create your identity within that adaptation?
And Dr. Lama actually flipped it on its head in a very funny way. And it was a very sort of, it was an easy part of the interview to actually miss. When she was applying, because she did her undergraduate in Saudi Arabia, and then she applied to do a master's in the UK. And she used all the tropes that were sort of perceived of what a Saudi woman would be like in order to get in.
So I decided to go to King's before they answer me, so that at least I can ask for an interview. It was the trend. I played woman, Saudi Arabia, always looked at as being, need support, Western world, Commonwealth, UK,
yeah. You played all the cards.
Country.
You put all the cards
Absolutely.
on the table. It was very clever. She subverted everything that was, seen as a negative into a positive. So they obviously had maybe, they wanted to diversify. They wanted to have a Saudi woman, graduate as a scientist. And so she played all that up in the interview, and she says it, laughingly, and it's funny. It's funny. I mean, she's obviously, very smart, knows exactly how she's seen, and used it to her advantage. And I think it was really funny.
I mean, I think the one thing I would say that every guest, well, I would say didn't have, so a converse, but like I barely heard any stubbornness when it came to eventually adapting to the situations. And it's not to say that they didn't have a strong reaction when they were told no, or when they couldn't do it. But the stubbornness was driven in a positive direction to say, fine, then I'll pave a different path. That's important when you are presented with these pivot points in your life, to be able to go back and say, okay, well, this is what's in front of me now, and how do I adapt around it, as opposed to saying, absolutely not, this is the only way I can move forward.
We'll continue our wrap-up episode, as well as take a peek into Season 3 right after this short break. Welcome back. You're listening to the wrap-up episode of What I Did Next from A&T Media. There was also something I wanted to bring up, Chirag, about the season, which was something that we didn't confront in Season 1, but came up twice in Season 2, which is, we're not a current affairs show. We're not tied to news or our interviews don't have to be aired in a particular timely manner. So in some of our cases, we've been doing interviews way ahead of when they air. And two in particular from this season, we did that way. One was Kim Ghattas, and the other one was Nada Dibs, both Lebanese, both based in Beirut. And both those interviews were conducted before summer, so before summer 2021. And, summer 2021 was a major pivot in the course of the country's history. And there's been a major economic implosion going on in Lebanon. And you and I had this conversation about whether, in my voiceover that we record, nearer to the airing of the episode, whether I should make mention of the fact of what's happening in the country and superimpose a layer of like current affairs onto the interview. And then you and I decided, actually, no, we're not going to go down that route. We're going to remain much more faithful to our original concept and talk purely about their life journeys. And, I've been thinking a lot about that since then, because I've kept in touch with everyone I've spoken with, and we check in with each other. And I still wonder whether in those two situations we should have done it differently. And I don't know about that. What do you think?
a couple of thoughts, right? I think we have to again think about that original mission to some degree, and I think that we have to stay true to that. I think we are in a world today, and I think that's where this is difficult sometimes. Is we are in a world where it's so easy to almost knee-jerk react to things, create statements where perhaps there isn't a need for one. And I'm not saying that these are not things we can comment on. We are commenting on them now, but I think in the context of the show and what the show stands for, which are the personal stories of these people and their life journeys. I think ultimately, and that's kind of what we base the decision on, is does it impact their story in a way that it would be incorrect to not include this. And as a contrasting example, right? During Kim's childhood story, there was a lot of talk about the war in Lebanon, right? From a couple decades ago. And that was a part of her story. It was an instrumental part of her story. And she had comments about a lot of things related to the political situation there. She's written 2 books around these topics, and you guys discussed them too, and you guys discussed them specifically around, again, the politics and the worldwide situation that exists in the Middle East and why it exists in certain ways. Again, you guys didn't get into too many details, but again, it was mentioned. And all of those things stayed in because, again, they are part of the pivotal moments of this person's journey. And I think, again, it would almost have been beyond incorrect. I don't know what the word is, but I think the story would have lost integrity, perhaps is the way I would put it, if we had taken that out, right? And whereas in these cases where you're talking, I think they didn't, and that's what kind of helps us make that choice.
No, and I think that's where the edits come in, and we have to kind of be a bit cutthroat about it, and we have to stick with our original concept for it to stay true to itself, and for it to be able to continue with other guests. Because what if we make a call down the line where, there is something similar comes up, but we decide not to include it? So we can't say yes to one and not to all, basically. So I think it's the right decision.
Yeah, and I think also, I hate to say it that way, where there is space for commentary on these topics, which there are tons of spaces to do that, and maybe our guests want to do that. We don't want the show to become that, right? So ultimately, once we start doing that, then we might have cases where guests come on specifically to do that. And that's not something we want to encourage. And again, this is not us taking away from the ability of the guests to do whatever and stand for everything that they stand for on their own platforms. But ultimately, that's what it goes back to our purpose.
Maybe the trick is to invite these people on again down the line and see if this actually becomes part of their story. That's one way of doing it, but not. No,
and 100%. And I would think that ultimately, if it does, as like we said, as in Kim's case, it absolutely was, then it's important that it becomes part of their story, right? But if you look at, say, for example, in Hassan's case as well, I think, and even it never even came up. It was not just something we edited. It's just the way he told the story, where he just mentioned the situation and said, well, it's not comfortable for me. And he left it at that, right? Because it wasn't,
that's right.
It wasn't part of his story as much as it was just saying, well, that was the environment, and hence this is what I did.
That's right.
And so I think it is a fine line. I agree. I mean, we could probably debate this, but I think on some level that was the agreement, that's what we agreed on when we were in that editing room to decide how we should handle those topics. Okay, so I think let's now talk about what's coming up in season 3.
Yeah, actually, we're looking to introduce some new staple questions. We thought that it would be a nice change after 2 seasons. It's always trial and error with these things, isn't it? Sometimes you get some questions that offer a lot of really great insight, like the dinner party question. For me, was a really fun one in season 1 and 2. So one of our questions takes inspiration from a wonderful book by Malcolm Gladwell. It's called The Tipping Point, and it was one of the first books he wrote. And it's considered a sort of a marketing almost a textbook at this point. It's a really great book, and it basically talks about how small actions at the right time and in the right place and with the right people can create a tipping point. And this can be for anything from a product to an idea or a trend. And he talks about 3 different types of individuals, and he says that each of these types of characters or character traits spread the message of these products in different ways. And I thought it would be kind of fun to ask our guests which personality trait they most identified with. And it's a fun question. And I think, like with a lot of things in life, nothing is all or nothing. So I think what we end up finding is, that it's an amalgam of different things.
Yeah, and again, it goes back to a little bit of reflection, right? When you look back at your life and look at the things you've done so far, obviously there's more to come. How do you envision that? How do you perceive that, as you just said, in the way it goes? Which I think has been true of both of our original questions as well. Even though we would talk about the dinner party as being kind of this fantasy land of bringing people together, but it's like this little window into what they perceive they want, right? In terms of whether it's information, knowledge, whether it's fun, whether it's whatever.
Yeah. So we have another question which we're looking at is looking at the ideas of tradition. And I think this is particularly interesting because of where we're based and because we're in the Middle East, where tradition is so ingrained in our day-to-day life, and it forms such a backbone to society, that I like the idea of asking our guests if what their sort of family traditions were when they were growing up, and to ask them if those traditions are still around, and if not, or even if they are, if they've added new traditions. So, for example, they might have grown up, having a meal with their extended family once a week. I find that in today's world, that's harder to do. And I wonder whether people are doing that. And if they're not, then what are they doing instead? How do they keep family dynamics alive? What sort of traditions are they doing? And I think importantly as well, what are the traditions that they want to instill in their own children in this age of, information overload, where we can all go down our little rabbit holes of the internet and just get lost. And I think it's important to have a strong offline life with your family. And I'm curious to know what people think. Yeah.
Yeah, and it goes a little bit to what we were talking about earlier in the episode, right, about how pivotal childhood is, because we've seen that across our guests, and we see that as a commonality, right, that those years, those formative years, as we call them, have had such a huge impact on how things have turned out for them or how they've perceived things and so on. And so I think this plays such an interesting part. And again, the last a couple of decades have seen this massive transition, right, from something that was very traditional, something where we had tremendous offline lives, into somewhere where even today, and I see that with, for example, even people of the older generation being so digital and have finally come around to just adopting it and living in their phones. The pioneers of at least traditions for me, right, like my parents, for example. And then the other side of it, which I do see sometimes, where I see maybe not even one generation, but like a couple of generations away, or a generation and a half away, so to speak, where there's this sort of return, right? They've become so detached, and they have no inkling of a lot of the traditions, that they are now exploring it on their own. And of course, access to information is possible.
Definitely.
So they've started doing
and
that
I think
more.
Something that strengthened that last point you made, Chirag, is COVID. I think people have really had a reassessment of what's important and what isn't. And, we were so reliant on technology in lockdown, wherever we were living, that I think a lot of people have made a really conscious effort to get off it. I was speaking to a friend yesterday, and he was saying, he's a professor in AUC, and he was saying to me, they've all gone back to full-time teaching in person, and how relieved he is because he was just online all the time. And so, that for him was a big deal to be able to get back into some kind of reality. But, people are reassessing, and people are trying to go back to an authentic, more of an authentic life. And I think, maybe that will allow people to create new traditions and start up, new ways of being with their loved ones. And And that can only be a good thing, I think.
Absolutely. Which makes it interesting as we go into our next question, which is a little bit of an online question, funnily enough.
Yeah, it is actually. So it kind of goes counter to what we were just saying. But it's a really fun question. So, it's basically posing the question, are you camp Twitter or are you camp Instagram? And again, like our Malcolm Gladwell question, you can be both. It is allowed. You don't have to be one or the other.
Yeah.
But I think it's a fun one because I use each platform extremely differently. For me, Twitter is a much more political platform. I actually, use it for news. I use it for breaking news.
It's a lot more real time and so on.
Real time, and it's more about polemics, and it's more about discussion and argument and so on. Instagram is just like when you're in the waiting room of a doctor. You're in the doctor's waiting room, and you're just waiting, and you're killing time, and it's just in my mind, it's a lot less serious. Yeah, it's the equivalent of magazines. Yeah. It's less serious. It's fun, and you get to catch up with your friends that way. I think as well. That I've got a lot of friends all over the world, and this is a way of keeping in touch with them and their lives and getting a glimpse into what they're up to. So that for me is kind of fun. So following from that initial, are you camp Twitter or camp Instagram? We then ask the guests. If you could only follow 5 people on each of those platforms, who would you choose?
Yeah, and I think it's a little bit akin, for me, it's a little bit akin to the dinner party question. In a way, it's not the same thing, of course, but it's that kind of thing to say, like, in your world or in your circle, like, who are the 5 people that you want to keep and retain, or if you were to start over, who are the only 5 people you would really want to follow on the platform that you actually are gaining something from or learning something from or want to interact with, which is very different from our general following, right? Which tends to be quite bloated, and we have random people in there that we don't necessarily even engage with ever.
Exactly. And again, as you said, it zooms in on their real interest and the real heart of where their focus is.
Yeah, brilliant. So that's what we have coming up in season 3 as a little bit of a twist. This is something, by the way, I think we would love to also hear from you as you're listening to us, what your answers might be to these questions on Instagram. So that's, if you just look for What I Did Next, we'll be posting the questions up there over the next couple of weeks. And we'd love to hear how you guys respond to these questions, because I think that would be quite telling.
I think that would be really fun, and I'd love to be able to, as we go forward, Chirag, have more interaction with the listeners as well. I think that would be really fun to get their feedback and any kind of comments they have. They know how to do it, so it would either be through the website, which you can find on the Instagram page, or on Instagram itself.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of this wrap-up episode and essentially the end of season 2 as well. And we're sort of prepping and preparing and getting ready for season 3. I think we would be... Well, we want to thank you as listeners who've been with us throughout this journey. We also want to thank our sponsors.
Absolutely. We've been very lucky that we've had Marrakech have sponsored the show almost from the very beginning, from season 1. And, a big shout out to the team there. And also, I was very happy that EFG Hermes were able to join sort of halfway through season 2. So I'm very grateful to their team as well. And I just want to say thank you very much to both companies. As we reach the end of season 2, I have a couple of announcements. Firstly, I'm happy to let you know that production for season 3 is underway with a great lineup of guests from across the region and from across different sectors and walks of life. So stay tuned for the upcoming season. The other exciting news is that through the ANT Media umbrella, we're working on a second podcast series. This new show will be very different to What I Did Next, but like all ANT Media podcasts, will be for and from the Middle East region. We'll update you as the show develops. And finally, I want to wish you all a fantastic holiday season. Stay safe, have fun, and catch you all in 2022.